Thanks, everyone, for coming out. My name is Kent Bai. I do the Voices of VR podcast, and today I'm going to be talking about the ultimate potential of VR, which I've asked over 2,000 people over the last 8+ years, and I'll be covering both the promises and perils of VR. So yeah, I've been doing the Voices of VR podcast and doing an oral history of VR, and I've been really fascinated with how VR has been emerging within the industry, and I just wanted to be on the front lines talking to the makers and the creators. And as I've been doing that, I've always been asking them, what is the ultimate potential of VR? And then also the ethical dilemmas and moral dilemmas of VR have naturally emerged out of this process of being in conversation. So I'm going to be going through the first two sections, like more primer introductory stuff, and then we'll be diving into the landscape of the VR potentials and perils. So I wanted to go into first the 4 evolutionary phases of tech, and then we'll give a primer of presence and embodiment, and then the landscape. So Simon Wardley has this model of technology evolution where he has these 4 distinct phases where there's initially the genesis of the prototype of this academic idea that's possible, and there's the custom-built enterprise applications that are being made, and then it gets launched into a consumer product, and then maybe potentially at some point it gets into a ubiquitous commodity. So there's kind of like this 4 evolutionary phases of tech that happens, and so we can look at this in VR to elaborate. So back in 1968, we have Ivan Sutherland with the sword of Damocles of this idea of fusing all this technology together for the very first time. And then in the mid-'80s, early '90s, you have VPL, Jan Lanier, starting to do these virtual reality headsets for the enterprise. The machines were around $1 million each, and so it was not necessarily accessible for most consumers, or any consumers really, until we have the consumer revolution of VR that's been happening from 2013 to the present, where we've had a confluence of all the display technologies, IMUs, and everything was basically cheap enough to have this revolution of consumer virtual reality. And then eventually at some point, will we have the ubiquitous nature of AR and VR? It's a bit of an open question as to when that might be happen. I have a sense that it's inevitable, but it's probably more of a matter of when. We may enter some winters. It's like the Heisenberg uncertainty where you know either the position or the velocity, but you can't know both. I feel like that with VR, where I feel like it's going to happen at some point. I just don't know when. So people are like, oh, is VR dead? But I feel like there's enough insights that I've learned from VR that as we look at VR, we can understand the potentials of the human experience. And as long as we know the bounds of the human experience, we can look at how technology is influencing that, whether that's VR, whether it's AR, whether it's AI, or any technology. So that's kind of the approach that I'm trying to take in this talk here. So again, we have these different phases of the prototype and genesis. We have the custom-built enterprise, and then the consumer product, and then ubiquitous commodity. And a lot of what I try to do is focus on, okay, what's happening in these enterprise spaces, what's happening in the B2B, in these other areas of VR that people may not be aware of, to see how that might be influencing the future of consumer tech. So another example, we can go back to the early 60s. Actually, it was like the first motion capture systems were like 1962 with the Harrison's Animac. Just imagine, at the very brink of computer technologies, they're already doing motion capture. Then you move into late 80s and up until 2009, you have performance capture, so being able to track different aspects of your face and to translate that into CGI characters. And then 2015, I was actually at GDC and had a chance to check out the face shift technology, which eventually was bought by Apple and is in a lot of phones right now. But you have these depth sensor capture that has the emotional expressivity, and that's something that has continued to be in tech. But that came into the Vive facial tracker in 2021, which was in a peripheral that you can add onto the VR headset to be able to capture your face. And then now with the MetaQuest Pro, you have it built into the headset. So you can see the evolution through these different phases to see how the technology kind of evolves and diffuses out into the culture. So I'm going to do a little bit of a primer of presence and embodiment, because when you think about VR, what makes it so special, it is this aspect of both presence and embodiment. So I just want to give a little bit more context before I dive into these other potentials. So when I went to the Oculus Connect 1 back in 2014, Brendan Airbay, the CEO of Oculus at the time, who's basically on stage saying that one of the most important things is presence. And I'm very familiar with presence from more esoteric mindfulness and meditation, but these ideas of presence have been a long part of virtual reality and a key aspect of what makes VR so different than other technologies. So Mel Slater has defined 2 aspects of presence in terms of the place illusion and the plausibility illusion. The place illusion is essentially that you believe that you're in a place, even though that you're not. The plausibility illusion is that you think that everything is happening is real and plausible, even though you know it's kind of a virtual simulation. But at the same time, you have this suspension of disbelief that you're immersed into these worlds. So the way that I look at these aspects of presence are dimensions of active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. And I think a good way to look at this is to see that the existing communication media have a center of gravity. So you can look at the video game technologies that are all about expressing your agency and will and interacting into the dynamic unfolding process of a video game. Then you have the mental and social presence, which is a lot of communication technologies and social media and the written language and narration and literature, but also the internet and human-computer interaction. So there's all this other dimension of the ways that we communicate with each other. And then we have the emotional presence, which film is all about building and releasing tension and modulating your emotions through both the music and the mood and lighting and the vibes, but also through the process of editing and storytelling. And then we get into the embodied and environmental presence, which is really what is unique about virtual reality, is that you have this sense of both architecture and theater, of a sense of place, but also your direct sensory experiences for all your sight, touch, smelling, and haptics, and everything is basically fused into this new medium of virtual reality. So thinking about it simply, it's taking action, making choices, emotional immersion, and sensory experience. And all of these are all happening at the same time, and virtual reality is kind of blending them all together. Now, you can also look at the evolution of different communication media, where you have like from oral storytelling to theater to books, film, radio, TV, video games, internet, mobile phone. And as you have each of these subsequent technologies, you have a nested aspect of all the subsequent media is encompassing all the other aspects of the previous media. So you have this point where VR and AR is kind of encompassing all the previous media, and each of those media have like a center of gravity. Like video games is all about agency, and film is about emotional presence, and books are all about like the mental aspects of your imagination and language. And so as we move on and think about this concept of embodied cognition, when we think about cognition, we tend to think about, okay, all that's what's happening in the brain, but it's also what's happening out through our entire body, our sensory experience. And embodied cognition is the fact that thinking doesn't just happen in the brain. It actually happens distributed throughout our entire body. We have our motor cortex. It's all about moving. As we move, that is impacting how we think. And so moving is thinking, but it's also embedded within the context of the world. So there's this relational context of which the world that we're situating in will impact how we think, as well as all the aspects of our body. So when you have immersive technologies that are impacting the way that we move, you're now going to change the way that we are thinking and the way that we communicate and understand the world. So if you look at some of the different embodied technologies, we can go back to 2015, which is the GDC with the HTC Vive having like hand track controllers that were super accurate to sub-millimeter accuracy. And then following that, I went to Sundance of 2016, where it was like my first experience of having full body tracked experiences, where it was like feeling like I was fully immersed into the sense of embodiment. They've been having these motion tracked experiences for many, many years, but in terms of Sundance being a nexus for diffusing out into the culture. And then January 4th of 2017 at CES, HTC announced these trackers to hook into the Vive trackers. And so then you have communities like VRChat where people are putting these body trackers all over their body starting like August of 2017. And that's cultivated this entire underground movement of dance scenes and rave culture within VRChat because people are fully embodied within these avatars. You have this virtual body ownership illusion. So we're moving into a world where we're going to have like pose estimation from artificial intelligence, either embedded within the context of the headset, or we may have to have like an external system that's really getting a high quality aspect of how we're moving our body. But I feel like full embodiment within VR, whether it's indigenous to like the headset or external, is like an inevitable evolution for where technology is going. And the next frontier is things like non-invasive neural interfaces, which are these watches that are going to be from like Control Labs, which is acquired by Meta, which has an ability to track what's happening in what they call electromyography or EMG. So it's able to detect the firing of an individual motor neuron through artificial intelligence, which means you can just think about moving, and that thought of moving will allow you to move a virtual avatar. So it's basically this interface that's getting into this whole other aspect of the intention of movement for us to do different types of human-computer interaction. It's the future of HCI when it comes to certainly augmented reality, but also potentially in VR to be able to have all sorts of exotic embodiments. So that's kind of like an overview of both the presence and the future of where we're at right now, and it's going to only get even more high fidelity. All right, so we're going to get into the landscape of VR potentials and perils. Now, I went to the Laval Virtual in 2019, and did a whole brainstorm of different ethical and moral dilemmas, and we started to kind of map it out into a different cartography. And then later in 2019, I did a whole XR ethics manifesto. And in that talk, after all these different interviews, what are the full landscape of all the ethical and moral dilemmas of VR? And this is a whole half-hour talk that I did. And I've done work with the IEEE Global Initiative of the Ethics of Extended Reality. We took this mapping and created 8 different white papers, and I have a whole 14-hour series diving into all these things. So we're not going to dive into every single dimension here, but suffice to say that I'm using this as a way to enter into both the potentials and the perils. And this is kind of like an overview of some of those different aspects. Okay, so I'm going to start with entertainment and gaming because I feel like that's where the consumer VR is starting. We've had a long history of other contexts, but for anybody that's seen what's happening with consumer VR, it's been driving through gaming. Things like Beat Saber, getting into these deep flow states. Your body is now a controller, so you're using your body to engage with these different puzzles as stuff is coming at you. And entertainment is the thing that is driving the resurgence of VR. The early adopters are the gamers. Exercise in VR has actually been a bit of surprising for some folks, but you end up having this ability to actually get real exercise. And exercise is really boring. People don't like to do it. So things like Supernatural give you like a coach and an excuse to go into these immersive experiences and actually enjoy your exercise. And so that's been a huge driver as well for early adopters of people doing fitness in VR. Half-Life Alyx has been one of the most amazing exploratory adventures. You have this going into another fantasy world and this exquisite amount of world building and this interactive experiences. I feel like that's the pinnacle of the types of gaming experiences that I've had from Valve expanding out the Half-Life series. Just an amazing story and experience to have. But the other aspects that I've been covering a lot within the context of my work is I've been going to things like Sundance and South by Southwest and Tribeca and the Venice Film Festival and IFA Doc Lab since 2016, and I like to go to these different experiences and see all the different stories and talk to all the different storytellers and makers and just get a sense of where things are going. And I feel like storytelling is actually going to be a huge driver as we move forward into the future of spatial computing. And this is a slide from Alien Rescue, which I feel like is one of the most immersive stories that I've been, because I was a character and I was like live action role playing with other actors, and we got to go on this whole adventure, and there's different choices I had to make. And so it's like we're moving from the storytelling to the story living, where I'm becoming a part of the process of an unfolding dynamic experience that is being cultivated and created by other people. And my participation is actually changing and shifting the overall experience. So immersive storytelling is a huge thing that I've been focusing on, and I feel like it's going to be a big part of what drives adoption of VR in the future, even if Meta is super obsessed with games and has been not giving storytelling its full due, in my opinion. Even though there's a lot of great stuff that's second tier to, there's a lot of Ready Player One visions for what's driving the metaverse for Meta, and anyway, I'll move on. The holodeck is just this idea that you could speak out and say, give me this experience. I mean, we're actually so close to this already happening. I mean, I expect to see this. I mean, it's already happening. People say, I want this. Give me experience. The thing is, it doesn't understand story, so it's just like images without much arc. But the holodeck is generative AI plus VR. We're like on the cusp of that, of the next 2 to 5 years, 10 years, where it's going to be is going to be like mind-blowing. Artists are blazing new neural pathways. Pete Moss told me this very early, like look to the artists, what the artists are doing, because artists, they are taking what's possible and they're pushing the limits of what's possible. So you go into an experience and you experience something that you literally couldn't experience in physical reality. And so that is blazing new neural pathways. And so when you come out of VR, it's actually changing the way that you look at reality. And that's what Jaron Lanier says, is that the experience happens once you take the VR headset off. Creation tools is something that, things like Tilt Brush has now been open sourced into OpenBrush and Gravity Sketch and all sorts of tools that you can be in VR and be in this dreamlike environment and capture different aspects of your imagination and create things. With generative AI, that boundary between your imagination and how you're actually able to experience it is only going to get smaller and smaller. It's going to get easier and easier. But I think this has been a blocker for what's holding VR back, is that it is very difficult to be able to create these types of immersive 3D experiences. But with the 3D creation tools on top of generative AI, it's going to open up this new vista of possibilities. So some of the perils, obviously, everybody who thinks about VR is like, well, it's all about escapism and addiction. And I feel like most people go that to the default. I think there's actually a lot of dimensions of people connecting more to other people within these virtual environments, but it is actually a problem or issue. I remember Carl Krantz told me that he was in VR and he spent 12 hours in VR and he only thought he was in there for 2 hours. So imagine going into VR experience and coming out and you've been in there for 12 hours and you have this issue of what if these technology companies are hacking our brains to the point where they're just getting us to stay in there for their own surveillance capitalism needs? That's an issue if we don't have a larger ethical direction for how this technology develops, and we can have like Candy Crush in VR, but like way worse. So adult content is something that is a part of VR, and there's I think a misperception that people are like, oh, porn is going to drive all of VR, and gaming has actually been the driver of VR, but there is 360 videos, there is 18-plus content within VR chat and teledildonics and haptic innovations that are happening in the realm of adult content. And I guess the ethical issue is there's actually no age verification anywhere on VR to actually know what the age of some of these people are. And some of these experiences within VR chat especially are 18-plus. And so you have situations where you might have children grooming or just inappropriate situations for minors. So that's something that has to be sorted out as we move forward. All right. So moving on to medical health. So medical health is actually one of the issues that's actually have like 35 years of research that there's been so many different innovations for what's happening. The thing that blew my mind was at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference in 2014 when James Blaha had created this experience at the time was called Diplopia, now called Vivid Vision, where he's able to essentially cure his lazy eye with VR. His eye needed to be trained like a muscle, and he was using VR to train that muscle and wasn't able to see in 3D before using this, and then afterwards he was able to see in 3D. So you have this idea of neuroplasticity where you can literally rewire your brain. So that's been a huge aspect. There's so many different aspects of medical applications when it comes to VR. There was actually, just recently, Walter Greenleaf gave a talk where he said that there's now more than 300 emerging VR and AR companies. You don't see a lot of that from like the mainstream VR press because it is so focused on gaming. But he's sort of mapping out all these different medical applications of VR. And for me, this is like the thing that is the most exciting. However, Meta has kind of like ignored enterprise and actually been very antagonistic because they kind of want to skip that enterprise phase and they want to skip straight to the consumer market. So they create privacy policies that are antithetical to HIPAA and everything else. So there's a lot of ways in which Meta has been actually holding back VR because of their obsession of trying to push it and rush it and not have it organically grow through the enterprise phase first. The end result is that there's a lot of stuff that's happening in medical field and none of the people in medical VR can even really use the Meta projects. They have to go to like Pico and other like HUC. Anyway, Walter is elaborating the different use cases, and at the high level, there's like training, assessments, interventions, adherence, care delivery, and prevention and wellness are kind of like the different types of applications that we're seeing in medical XR. This is an experience that I did at SVVR, Spy BioFlight VR. One of the most intense experiences I had. I'm in an emergency room. There's a baby that's turning purple and dying, and the mother is there screaming for her child to be saved, and you have to figure out what to do, and you have no idea what to do because you're not a doctor. And you like have to save this baby's life. And it's like I'm thrown into this experience, and it was like so intense. But the idea of creating the different contextual dimensions for you to make the right choices, that is what makes VR so powerful. Is that you are embedded into that context, and you have to make the actual embodied movements to do this. And so these different types of training scenarios have been really amazing. And Skip Rosa has been doing a lot of stuff with PTSD exposure therapy. And the idea here is that you're able to give people a little bit of experience and help heal them through the exposure therapy. The other side is that if VR can heal people from trauma, it can also induce trauma. So what are the ways that we can think about what are these trauma triggers for people and creating situations that are going to be perpetuating or amplifying either existing trauma or creating new trauma? All right, so I'm going to do a quick bit into resources, money, and values. So there's a lot of hype about the metaverse, and I'm really skeptical about most of it because the term's really been hijacked, I think, by other people that are just whopping onto it. But I look to the Cronus group and the interoperability standards of things like OpenXR, things like the Metaverse Standards Forum, where you have different industry folks that are trying to put down the underlying baseline of what those open standards are going to be to actually drive the future of the metaverse. And ironically, it's going to be companies like IKEA that are trying to create these open standards with GLTF to be able to put furniture on the web and not necessarily always the gaming part. So I feel like the future of the metaverse, look to OpenXR, the Cronus Group, and the Metaverse Standards Forum to see what kind of open standards are created out of that. I think access to XR technology is a huge aspect of like all dimensions of technology, but when we think about where this technology is going, who has access to the technology and what's blocking access to other people having access to this technology, there's already a digital divide. VR, if anything, is accelerating that digital divide without any way of thinking about that as a holistic level. This is more at the platform level in economics, but it's important to point out. We have virtual gift economies, which AnyLand VR, and also a large part of like VR chat, because it doesn't have an embedded economy. There's a lot of people like sharing culture and art and exchanging different aspects for the communities within VRChat. The prefabs community is creating all these different stuff, and it's really like a gift economy that's being developed that's really driving so much innovation. And things like Anyland was doing this, but also VRChat. And VRChat has like an optional subscription model to be able to fund them. So you can pay or not, you can still have access to it. But it's like, hey, maybe we're going to move into this type of model where you get a little extra things when you have a subscription, but we're not going to rely on other models. We have virtual skins and avatars, which is something like Fortnite or Roblox or even like Rec Room. Your virtual appearance is a big part of what's driving the economy. So that's an option. It's also at the platform level where you have both Meta and Apple and Google taking the 30% cut. And there's been a lot of like antitrust lawsuits, and there may be stuff that is coming forth from the EU that's trying to address this, but there's like a failed lawsuit from Tim Sweeney to try to address this. But at the end of the day, do we want to have the future of the next paradigm of computing have 3 major companies take a 30% cut of everything you do? We wouldn't have a lot of those companies without them being developed on the open platform like the PC. So it seems like if we're going to move into this world, it's going to create these disparities at an economic level that we have to kind of figure out. Then we have the dimension of surveillance capitalism, which is driving the business models of companies like Meta and Google. And there's actually a lot of open gaps for as we move into the future of virtual reality technologies. It's going to get even worse. I just did an interview with Nita Farahani, who has a book that just is coming out on Tuesday called The Battle for Your Brain, which is talking about all these different dimensions of neurotechnologies, which includes aspects of virtual and augmented reality, but also other things like brain-computer interfaces. And we're kind of sleepwalking into dystopia of what's happening with the future of these technologies. So that's important to set up into now that we get into like the self, biometric data, and identity. Because we're moving into a realm where we're combining different aspects of neurotechnologies. This is a headset that was made by OpenBCI, and they're adding different things like EOG, EEG, EMG, EDA. These are all like biometric signals that are coming in that are eventually, as things are integrated, they're going to be feeding into our experiences. And that, on the one hand, they're going to be able to be great for like mental health and wellness and focus experiences for you to like really dial in your attention and your productivity. And also do like feedback loops for immersive stories and games, and it's going to be really cool. But on the other hand, that data in the hands of the wrong person is also going to be revealing all of this really intimate information. So VR has like this existential threat to privacy. And right now, the way that privacy laws are made, they're not really addressing the biggest threats from VR. So there's things like psychographic inferences from eye gaze data. So you have this research that you can just look at the eye and determine different things like gender, age, biometric identity, your cultural background, mental health, personality traits. And so essentially, this is what Britton Heller calls biometric psychography. So there's all these psychographic aspects. As they have access to this type of data, they're able to make even more detailed inferences about us. And that type of biometrically inferred data, whether it's about our likes, our dislikes, our preferences, none of this is covered by any privacy law at all. It's a huge gap, and it needs to be covered in some degree. So as we move forward, you can look at things like this is taking my presence framework. You have everything from behaviors, intentions, actions, movements, mental thoughts, cognitive processes, cognitive load, social presence, your affective state, your emotional sentiment, your facial expressions, microexpressions, your stress, arousal, physiological reactions, eye gaze, attention, body language, muscle fatigue. And not only for each of these, they're all going to be fused together. Just looking at your hand pose and head pose, and you can extrapolate your eye gaze data from research. And so as these things get fused together, it's essentially going to be able to map out so much of the intimate aspects of ourselves. And Nita Farahani summarizes these in terms of like self-determination, freedom of thought, mental privacy, which for her includes both the physiological reactions and the affective reactions. But this book, it's called Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology. This is the podcast that's published for me now. I just did a really in-depth interview. For her, she's trying to define this new human right, what she calls cognitive liberty. And for cognitive liberty, it's an umbrella term that includes both self-determination, freedom of thought, and mental privacy. And that you need to define these human rights in order to have them diffuse out through international law. And another approach is Raphael Yusto neurorights, which is trying to identify things like the right to mental privacy, the right to identity, the right to agency, the right to fair access to mental augmentation, and the right to be protected from algorithmic bias. So if you break this down, if you are able to violate someone's mental privacy and then map out their identity, then you can start to nudge them in ways that is undermining their right to agency, because there's an asymmetry of power. If you have all this data and you're able to maybe understand people better than they understand themselves, you can start to kind of hack into their fixed action patterns and start to control and manipulate them in a way that is undermining their sense of cognitive liberty. So Nita Farahani is saying that we need to establish a new human right of cognitive liberty, and from there that needs to diffuse out into like EU, and then from there all these other things, and eventually 5, 10, 30 years later in US, we'll get a US federal privacy law. The EU is basically like decades ahead of where we're at here. Like we need a federal privacy law here in the United States, but none of this stuff is in the discussion at all. So back to identity, you have the stylized expression of identity. So being able to choose your different avatar representation, and VRChat is probably the most expansive in terms of the different types of identity. I mean, have avatars made out of like 7 or 9 different cats, and just there's a lot of really wild stuff that like has blown my mind, just like seeing what's happening in the context of both like, Neos VR or VRChat. Both of these are 2 places where you see a lot of innovation with avatar representation. But if you're not giving people a choice to upload their own avatar, then you need to ensure that you have a diverse selection of avatars, because the last thing you want is to force people to be in a virtual experience where they don't feel like they have any identity that's representing how they identify themselves. So having that diversity selection of avatars is a key ethical component. Now, Meta is really hot on creating these kind of really creepy photorealistic codec avatars that are basically like, what you're seeing is not a picture, it's a recreation of someone's face. And when you see it animated, it's even more creepy. You can kind of see the thing down in the lower right. But they have a lot of effort of creating these photorealistic avatars. My sense is that most people want like these stylized, weird, like VRChat avatar representations and not the photorealistic. But if we do go down that route, then what happens when it comes to like deep fakes and AI voices to be able to spoof people's identities? So, these are some of the different Mark Zuckerberg avatars. But you can just imagine if you have these photorealistic avatars, then how do you ensure that you are you in these different platforms? And when we have this generative AI that's able to spoof people's voice and maybe even their mannerisms, how they move, and that's going to be an issue even more when we get into these virtual spaces. There's also this phenomenon of Snapchat dysphoria. As people use these facial filters, then they actually like more identify with these facial filters. They feel this fundamental uncomfortableness with their body that leads them to want to get plastic surgery. So we have this effect of, as people are modulating their identity, then what are the impacts for things like Snapchat dysphoria? And then consciousness hacking is something that's a little bit more of the exalted potential, where if you have access to all this, you have the ability to expand your mind, track your mind, do the quantified self, and push the limits of what you're able to do as a person. Then you have things like David Eagleman and Sensory Vest, where this is a haptic vest that is able to do sensory substitution. So you're able to turn your torso into an ear. So basically, if you're deaf, you could like take the haptic input and you get the data into your brain. You're able to somehow translate that into hearing. And so what are ways you're able to substitute existing senses or add new senses? So this is North Paw, where you put this device on your foot and you're able to know where true north is, and you kind of develop this sixth sense ability to know where the true north is after you have this on your body enough. So what's the ability to kind of expand your senses as you go out? And as we go forward in the transhumanism, it's going to get really weird. So early education, communication, we have telepresence. So telepresence is just when you're communicating with other people, you're in a shared space, and you get to hear like a dynamic spatialization of sound. Like there's a reason why coming to South by Southwest is different than having Zoom meetings. There's something about the spatialized presence of people together that is qualitatively different, but there's something the way that our memory works in terms of the way that we understand space and spatial context and where people are positioned in space. And if you want to turn to somebody and make a little snide comment that only you two can hear. So telepresence in VR is going to continue to be a huge part across many different contexts. Also data visualization. As you have this visualization of different data, it creates this spatial architecture that allows you to elucidate the different relational dynamics of information in data visualization. Early education and virtual field trips. KaiXR has been doing a lot of really amazing virtual tours and giving them to kids to take them to different museums. But the sad thing is that education is actually probably the biggest potential, but it's also the most underfunded and most underappreciated because there's not like a clear economic business model for it. So you read something like Ready Player One and you see like the oasis and this like sci-fi vision about what education could be, but there's only a handful of people that are really actually building it. Engage is doing a lot of amazing stuff, and there's been some communities in AltSpace, and KaiXR is doing great work, but again, it's like completely underfunded, underappreciated, but probably one of the biggest potentials. Also, if you think about the minimum age for VR, right now it's 13 for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that, as eyes are still developing and you have like vergence accommodation conflicts, then you don't want to put kids into VR because it may actually like mess up how their eyesight is developing over time. And so, and a lot of this is sort of like not have clear boundaries as for how that process works. A big reason why the minimum age is 13 is actually more due to privacy because of COPPA compliance, because with these companies that want to do a lot of surveillance capitalism, they want to gather all this data. They want to have to deal with having people less than 13. Rec Room is actually probably one of the areas that has been doing a lot of stuff younger than 13, but Meta kicked off all the younger than 13 off of the VR platform. But it's an issue of people that are less than 13 and they're in all these different spaces. Then how do you account for people that are not necessarily following what they should be following? So home, family, private property. So we look at different aspects of volumetric memories. I think this is actually going to be something that as time goes on, we're going to have more of these volumetric ways of capturing different scenes. And then photos are funny because you take a photo and the photo actually means more to you the more time goes on, if that makes sense. Like you look at something, you're glad you have that photo from 10 years ago. So we're going to have a lot of like volumetric moments from 2013 on where people are going back into these moments in time. But if you think about capturing memories and going back and capturing different aspects with your family, different spatial contexts, I mean, the Google Earth VR for me has been one of the really amazing experiences because I was like, I'm going to go to all the places I lived and I'm going to tell the story of my life based upon these geographic locations. I could virtually go to all those places in the course of like an hour and all these memories come up. And the ethical aspect is like, what does it mean to overwrite your memories based upon these virtual corrupted versions of the geographic places? But the ability to go and have those memories connect to the Earth and to do this virtual travel is another aspect is a huge part. And ideally, you come out and you actually want to be connected to the Earth and not just be like, oh, Google Earth is totally fine. I don't need to go anywhere, because there is an element of travel, but there's also like climate change and all the limits of that. Volumetric privacy is a huge thing because there's actually like a Fourth Amendment protection of your home and unreasonable search and seizures. But there's also interpretation of that, which means that when you give data to a third party, there's no reasonable expectation for that data being private. So it's basically eliminating the Fourth Amendment, all those protection privacies. And so what's that mean when you think about the volumetric privacy of your home and what happens to the data of these different scans of your places that are now going to potentially get in the hands of government officials that they shouldn't actually have access without due process or a warrant? Meta's actually working towards a lot of really creepy things, like what they call contextually aware AI. So if you just look at this for a moment, imagine you're cooking with AR, and the AR is telling you you've already added enough salt. Like, there's a certain element of cooking where you actually like tasting things, and maybe the AI is not going to be able to do that. But the idea that they have this other thing called episodic memory AI, which is, where did I put grandma's watch? So imagine what you would need for that. You would need to have this AI that's basically a big brother watching all your movements. And I don't want AI to be able to answer that question. That's like super creepy and a transgression of what I think is reasonable for what I want. So the problem is that you have companies like Meta saying, well, we want to do contextually aware AI. And you can look at things like Ego 4D, which is their challenges. So which is literally, this is what they want to do. They want to be able to say episodic memory, what happened when, forecasting, what will I do next, hand-object interactions, what am I doing now, and how, AV diarization, who said what and when, and social, how are we interacting? This is like the roadmap of where we're going for augmented reality, and I just hope that I am able to communicate the urgency of how ridiculous this is. Contextually aware AI is a really bad idea, and we need to do something to stop it. Other partnerships. So Joe Hunting did a really amazing documentary. It's on HBO Max. It's called We Met in Virtual Reality. It shows the cultivation of these different romantic relationships of people going on dates and really connecting at this romantic level. It's a really amazing film. I highly recommend checking out. But this idea of virtual dates is already happening. You know, we have this famous TED Talk that Chris Milk gave, VR as an empathy machine. I feel like there's a bit of a bifurcation of people who are like all on board of VR and empathy machine, and other people are like, there's a lot of limits to empathy, Paul Bloom against empathy, you know, a lot of problematic aspects of the colonial nature of going into places and seizing stories without the people that you're covering having full authorship of how that story is being told. On top of that, how much can you actually be in someone's shoes and see a video of what's happening in Syria and know what it means to be a Syrian refugee? So I feel like this is a big debate where there are a lot of potentials, but there's a lot of problems with this idea as well. Virtual harassment and bullying is something that, like, we're moving from a place of content moderation into conduct moderation. And so how are we behaving and how we modulate that? And it's going to be some AI overlords that are trying to determine this, because this is essentially not a problem that humans can solve, or there's going to be more of a self-moderated aspect that we have to figure out how do you enforce these codes of conduct that these companies have, because it is these marginalized populations of, you know, this intersectional axis of privilege, domination, oppression. You can look at the bottom side of all the different folks of like women, gender deviant, people of color, Aboriginal folks, lesbian, gay, you know, LGBTQ+, you know, all these different dimensions of oppression that we have embedded into our culture. This is just amplified in these virtual technologies, and there's not anything that's actually like by default going to be a part of the technological architecture that's going to change this dynamic. And so there's going to be a lot of dimensions for how do we actually create these spaces that are safe for people to be in, how do you moderate the conduct, and how do you enforce these codes of conduct. Death, collective resources, there's grief rituals like this experience by Paisley Smith called Homestay, where she's talking about a friend who died by suicide, and it's a whole ritual to honor his life. And so a really quite moving experience to find new ways that we can come together. And just this past week, there was a number of different funerals. I know Athena Demos is in the crowd and led a lot of really beautiful elegies for Altspace VR that just was sunsetted this past week. Actually, as I was flying out here, it was like the last moment of Microsoft pulling the plug. So what's it mean for these communities to exist and then to be taken away? How do we honor these experiences, these moments, these communities, these relations, these worlds that now are going to be gone, or at least they're archived, but there's different. There's a death. And so how do we use these virtual technologies to honor the lives that have come? Virtual violence is also a big thing in terms of these murder simulations. You know, there's been a lot of debate in terms of like 2D, like there's been no evidence that virtual violence in video games has any impact. But what happens when it's fully embodied and you're there and you have a presence? And it's like, ethically, there feels like there's something different for me when I've had different situations where I've been participating in a simulated murder or violence. There's a magic circle you enter into, but what's the line between that magic circle that you're entering into and when you're going through the embodied motions, then how much is that impacting us at a deep moral, ethical, psychological way? I did a bunch of interviews. It's called the gamer's dilemma. So like what degree are these different types of actions in virtual worlds? Are they ethical or not? And in this last series that I have covering XR ethics, I have a couple of people that are talking about that. Andrew Kissel, in particular, diving deep into the gamer's dilemma. So going on to philosophy, higher education, law, training is one of the VR's killer apps. So you have Striver, training of elite quarterbacks. You also have them training Walmart, and there's actually a lot of parallels there because you have to identify the different relational contextual dynamics of the defense of the linebackers, but you also have to identify what's happening in contextual dimensions of Black Friday and be able to make decisions on that. And so in the back room of every Walmart, there's a VR headset that's doing training. And there's also a lot of military training. There's going to be a dimension of like breaking down academic silos within virtual reality in these different contexts, and that's already started to happen. There's an interdisciplinary context with virtual reality. Being able to comprehend dimensions of complexity and see the different relational dynamics of things. Institute for the Future has done some interesting work. But as we move on, a lot of these immersive stories are all about trying to connect the dots between what is the hidden aspects of reality and how can we use these virtual experiences to tie together this sense of what's happening behind the scenes and what's the full relational dynamics of the nature of reality. Human rights laws and regulations I've mentioned before, but this is going to be a big part of like, what is the metaverse law? Is there going to be like, what's the global jurisdiction? What kind of existing human rights protections are we going to have in these virtual spaces? There's a metaverse initiative in the EU to sort of flesh that out. Speculative world building has been a really exciting potential in terms of like Planet City VR was an experience at Tribeca where there was a thought experiment to say, what happens if we put all 10 billion people into the state of Texas and let the rest of the Earth go back to seed, and would that be a viable solution for climate change? I don't think that's necessarily feasible, but what that gives you is a design problem for an architect to say, what are the technologies that you would need to do to be able to do that? And could you take those technologies and then put them out and diffuse them out in the world without having to sort of relocate 10 billion people into one place, which I don't think would be a good idea. But there's also like things like indigenous futurism, where there's a project called 2167 where you have indigenous creators sort of imagining 7 generations in the future. What kind of future do they want to imagine that gets out of the inertia of the moment right now? You know, this is not a ceremony piece that was at Tribeca that's also imagining this more etheric dimension of the relational dynamics of these different mythological creatures in relationship to us. Really amazing piece. Neurospeculative Afrofuturism was a piece that was at Sundance a number of years ago, using virtual reality, kind of imagine these different potential futures of a hair salon that has all these cutting-edge neurotechnologies, and what would it be like to go into this to get a haircut, but also have like different aspects of your brain being read. Future Dreaming was a piece by Sutu that he actually worked with a number of different Aboriginal teens where they imagined their lives 5, 10, and 20 years in the future. What was amazing was you get a sense of like, what is the dream of what you want your life to be? And I was able to go into these different experiences and get a real sense of who these teenagers were based upon these different experiences. So being able to imagine our future selves and what we want and what we desire and to actually sort of have an embodied experience of that to some degree, is that going to help us create this final causation that allows us to like live into that? Wonder and awe is a big, huge aspect of VR, and Kevin Mack and some of his different experiences have been a great part of kind of expanding my mind about what's possible about the nature of reality. And many different artists, I know Nancy Baker Cahill has been doing lots of amazing work as well in terms of like trying to create these different relational dynamics. So David Chalmers has a whole book called Reality Plus, where he argues that virtual reality is a real reality. There's a bifurcation that we like to say like, well, this is virtual and this is quote unquote real. What he's arguing is that there are experiences within this virtual context that are just as real and just as meaningful, and even if they're not in a physical reality, that can be just as real. And so he's arguing in this book that VR experiences and these virtual experiences are a genuine reality. And I've been doing a lot of work about process philosophy and this paradigm shift as we move away from this idea of saying that the reality is only of this physical material stuff, and actually looking at a metaphysical level that all of reality is made up of these processes and potentials that are unfolding, and that if you think about the quantum layer, there's all these relational dynamics of potential that the substance metaphysics doesn't actually really make sense of. Or if you have like the Everett's many world interpretation that sort of spatializes that out. But the point is that those relationships are a part of the underlying nature of reality. And so you can say that all of reality is made out of processes and relationships. And I think that makes a lot of sense for VR. And I've had a number of different interviews with Matt Siegel and Grant Maxwell that are kind of elaborating that through this historical, philosophical tradition. So the last three here, government, institutions, career, spatial design, lots of stuff with spatial architecture and other ways of anybody that's doing any type of spatial design. Virtual screens and productivity. If there's nothing else that VR can do other than to kind of replace your monitor, you put on a monitor and you have like 12 screens. You know, if Apple device can do that for like $3,000, if it's like 4K per eye, whatever, and it's high enough, then that may be good enough for people to start to adopt this. That may be like a productivity boost that people are like, you know what, I want the maximum number of screens, and that's like the sole use case that they start with. But that's going to be a thing eventually. We have this replacing of screens. Replace attention monitoring is one of the ethical dilemmas where we have, to what degree are you allowing the companies to track what's happening in your brain states and your attention, your focus, and this micromanaging of what you're paying attention to. So this is something that Nita Farahani covers a lot within Battle for Your Brain. Highly recommend her work on that. Also, governmental mass surveillance, whether it's China or the United States, to what degree is some of this data getting into the hands of oppressive authoritarian regimes and poking people to test their loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, or data that's for the third-party doctrine put into the mass surveillance of the United States? To what degree do you have all this biometric data that's being fed into that? And then the last two here, friends, community, collective culture. There's been lots of communities been cultivated in VR. Will continue to be lots of niche cultures that have been developing, people connecting upon shared identity. This LGBTQ plus meetup in Maltspace had people from around the world. If there's no people geographically located that puts their lives at stake, they're able to connect to a community in these virtual spaces. Hanging out with friends, obviously, that's a huge part of just going on these different adventures. Algorithmic bias is a huge aspect in terms of to what degree do we have algorithms that are having bias, that are amplifying aspects of discrimination at a systemic level. People that are the most vulnerable having even more injustices that are being done. And the work with the Algorithmic Justice League and the movie Coded Bias is a great reference for that. And then finally, the hidden exiled accessibility, so different ways that VR can start to combat isolation. Also, accessibility is both an opportunity for making different aspects of experience more accessible, but also a huge challenge in terms of how do we make this technology the most accessible as we can in order to include the most people as we can. So it's still like a big open question as we move forward. So that's sort of like an overview of all the different potentials, all the perils. And as I think about this question, at the heart of it is allowing VR to connect to yourself, connect to others, connect to the planet, and connect to all levels of reality. So Voices of VR podcast, you can look up, and also supported by Patreon. You can support me there. Awesome. Well, that's all the time I got. Thank you so much for coming out.